Hi everyone, and welcome to the new version of our comics and the graphic novel course. So obviously there's going to be some big changes as a result of the social distancing, coronavirus, quarantine thing going on. That said, I do want to try to make sure that these changes don't put undue pressure on you, since I know you're all also dealing with being home and having families you probably have to take care of, or having parents you're worried about, or kids, or feeling isolated. And so in general, I'm going to try to set things up so that it's as easy on all of us as possible, since none of us were expecting this. None of us signed up for this particular way of having a class. And so I'm going to try to make sure that we get something out of the class, but also that I don't set us up to fail. So, before we actually get into talking about graphic memoir and nonfiction comics, a few kind of administrative things to talk about. First of all, I will set up a discussion board for every class day. Obviously, some days are more lecture-y. You may or may not necessarily have discussion things you might want to write about. For those more discussy days, I'm sure there's a better word for that, but that's the best I could come up with. Those, I think, will focus much more on the discussion board. That said, because I know not everyone has great access to technology, I'm also trying to set things up so that even if you don't have a laptop or great internet, if you have a phone with data, you should still be able to participate in the course the way you need to. And so in addition to working through Blackboard, these videos will be posted on Blackboard. They'll be embedded there. And then discussion boards will be on Blackboard too. But in addition to that, I also am going to put links to this video in an announcement, which will get automatically sent to whatever email you have set up on Blackboard. So you'll be able to watch it from your phone without having to log in to Blackboard. And also, I'm going to try to set up a group me for our class. So you'll have that as another option for text participation. So if you, for some reason, can't, or having problems logging into Blackboard to do the discussion topics, you can also just kind of send a message to the group chat saying what it is that you want to say. And obviously both of those venues are also going to work fine for asking me questions or having concerns or anything like that. Other changes, at this point I've cut down the number of graphic responses in our listed in our syllabus. I'm thinking I may end up removing them entirely, just because I know no one's you can't turn them in hard copy, obviously, at least not without, postal mail. And it's also kind of tricky without access to a scanner. I guess maybe you can take pictures of things on your phone and text them to me. That can work. So definitely let me know, maybe in a discussion or an email, what you think. Like, do you think we should continue to do the graphic responses, or should we just cancel those entirely? I am still including our final comic / essay, whichever you choose to do. And for that, I think probably our best bet is going to be if you create it digitally and send it to me that way, that's fine. But you can also create it in paper and then just send me pictures of each page via text message or something. It's not ideal, but definitely it's what we've got, and hopefully you'll find you'll get something good out of having to be that creative during this quarantine if you choose to do the comic. Yeah, so for all that stuff though, I will ideally have your phone numbers, and I can't remember whether I posted mine on Blackboard, but if I haven't, I will do that. And so that way, you'll be able to text me, and I'll be able to text you if need be, and I'll be able to add you to the group chat. A few other things. This class is going to be asynchronous, so that means you do not have to be present at the computer at a particular time for something like Zoom. I just know that puts a really big strain on people, especially because a lot of folks, are having to work or having to take care of kids, and that can really mess up people's schedules. So I'm going to try to set things up asynchronously where you can kind of do it at whatever time works for you. So obviously this is going to be going up, Monday afternoon. If you don't get to it until Monday evening or Tuesday morning, that's fine. And even if you get to it after the next video comes up, you can still participate. You can still listen to the lecture. You can still be a member of the class, even if you're not available for that day or two. Finally, our readings. I've been trying to get as many of them as I can up on Blackboard as PDFs. There are a few that I'm still not 100% sure of. We are good for A Contract with God. We are good for Persepolis. We are good for The Dark Knight Returns. I did have to take off Super Indian because it was one of the, we needed to cut some things to make time since we lost a week. I am still trying to hunt down a copy of Dragon Ball digitally that I can put up, since I know not everyone has their books with them. If I can, we will do that. If not, we may need to switch to some other kind of manga that's more easily available or some other way of accessing Dragon Ball. So definitely let me know what you might want to do if you have alternate suggestions, something that we can easily get a hold of digitally. And by that I mean, not that I'm going to advocate piracy because I'm a federal employee and I cannot do that. But I will just say that, a lot of more popular stuff I've not had too much problems finding in perhaps not 100% legal ways. And that's how I've been able to upload them. But I have not been able to find Dragon Ball. So hopefully I will find a version of that, or we may need to choose another text. If you have suggestions for other texts we could do, instead definitely drop them my way. Try to pick something that you think will appeal to a good chunk of our class. Okay, so that I think. Oh, and Scott Pilgrim, I think I have online as well. So, really, the only reading that is an issue is Dragon Ball. So, that then moves us into our actual content for today, which is Introduction to Graphic Memoir and Nonfiction Comics. So, what are graphic memoir and nonfiction comics? These are going to be comics that are telling people's own stories. They're kind of autobiographical comics. In the case of graphic memoirs, in the case of nonfiction comics, they're telling nonfiction stories, things that actually happened. Now, as always, when talking about fiction and nonfiction, keep in mind that the line between those things is sometimes blurry. We tend to think of fiction as not true, it's fake, and nonfiction is it's true and reliable. But as the scandal that comes up every few years about someone's autobiography and things that turning out to not be true, a lot of things that are marketed as nonfiction can often have fictional elements, and by the same token, there are definitely fictional texts that are based on true stories or have nonfiction elements in them as well. That said, we tend to use these just to mean graphic memoirs, those autobiographical comics, people who are telling their own stories in comic form, and we kind of don't even think about whether those are fiction or nonfiction necessarily, although we would classify them as nonfiction probably. And for nonfiction comics, it tends to be comics that are historical or educational, basically focused on the same kind of things we'd expect from a nonfiction text. So, we're going to talk again primarily about America, but we'll have quite a bit of Japanese stuff here, manga, because I think some of those things were happening in manga before they were happening mainstream in American comics. And we have some other non-American stuff as well. So, without further ado, autobiographical comics and graphic memoirs. So, I'm not sure what the first graphic memoir is. The first ones that hit it big in the U.S. Come out in late 70s, early 80s. But before Will Eisner and his contract with God, and before Art Spiegelman and Mouse, both of which we briefly talked about at the beginning of the semester, you start seeing autobiographical comics make a bit of a splash in Japan. And this is a good example of it, and probably the one that I'm most familiar with. Keiji Nakazawa's I Saw It, which in Japanese is Ore wa Mita. So, Keiji Nakazawa was a survivor of the bombing of Hiroshima at 6 years old, and he wrote this comic about his experiences after he, grew up. It's pretty harrowing. Most of his family, who had not already evacuated to another city, died when the bomb trapped them under the debris of their house. The only ones who survived were he, his mother, and his infant sister, who had just been born, and the baby sister died a few weeks afterwards. So the only real survivors were him and his mom. It's a pretty harrowing story, so it's worth checking out, but be aware that if you do, even though it is in a kind of that sort of more cartoonish, less realistic particular kind of manga style, it does still have, people with their skin melting off and such. So, go into that knowing that if you decide to read it. The author actually also did a kind of fictional manga, a semi-autobiographical manga called Barefoot Gen, that was still very much based on those same experiences. So definitely, even before it hits it big in the US, we're seeing it kind of on the rise in Japan. So when it comes to American autobiographical comics, the two big ones that I've already mentioned are Mouse and The Contract with God, which we'll talk about in a second. But even before those come out, there starts to be another one that is a very, very long-running one, as you can see from the dates. Starts in 1976 and runs till 2008. It's called American Splendor by Harvey Pekar. And it's basically his kind of autobiographical comic based on his everyday life experiences as a file clerk at a VA hospital. And then, of course, he also talks about his personal life and things like that. He wrote it, but he recruited other people to illustrate, starting off with the kind of famous comics artist, like underground comics artist R. Crumb, who, as you can see, did the cover for this particular collection. They use his illustration. And this does not go with that standard monthly release. There might be an issue or two a year, but it also ran for 32 years, and so as a result, there's a lot of it, even if it's not being released super frequently. And also all created by a single guy, chronicling his experience over that 32 years. Contract with God is our first kind of one that really hits it big in the U.S., and obviously we'll be reading the title story from that for Wednesday. This is the first book to really popularize the term graphic novel, as you can kind of see from the cover. This was not the first one to use it, but it was the first one to popularize it. And it's after this book comes out that term actually starts getting used. Will Eisner, again, we kind of talked about him briefly in a couple of the previous presentations, but seminal, well-known comics creator, big set of comics awards called the Eisner Awards, so big name, and we'll talk more about him on Wednesday. The other big early American autobiographical comic is Mouse by Art Spiegelman from 1980. Spiegelman talks about his father's World War II experiences as told to him, and about his relationship with his father. So it's kind of this sort of family saga / him learning about his father's experiences and during the Holocaust and being kind of horrified by it. And Maus catches people's attention for probably several reasons. One, it is talking about the Holocaust, and it's one of those, like at this point in 1980, it's been long enough that folks are talking about the Holocaust in different ways, in part because, Holocaust survivors now have kids that have grown up and become adults themselves, like second-generation folks. And it also has this kind of interesting animal conceit going, as you can see from the cover. The Jews are represented by mice, and the Nazis by cats. And so all your different ethnic groups and country folks are represented as different kinds of animals. And then, of course, as you can also see from this cover, it did eventually win the Pulitzer Prize, which tends to be given to things that have a lot of artistic merit. So this is one of those real big drivers for the idea that, yes, comics can be art, and they can be literature, and they are things that are worthy of respect. So moving into more recent graphic memoirs, in the 90s, we have Epileptic by David B., or L'Ascension du Haut Mal in the original French. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've taken a French class and my accent is not great. But it means something literally like the rise of the grand mal, as in grand mal seizures, which is kind of epileptic seizure, the serious, very serious kinds. So this is a comic about the author growing up with a brother with epilepsy, and how that affected him, how that affected his brother, and how that affected their sister. Really, really kind of got a lot of critical acclaim, and again, one of those things that made people who had kind of been naysayers previously think, hey, maybe comics can actually be art in the same way that, like, a person's autobiography can be art, and they can be literature in the same way that can be literature. Persepolis, we will also be reading a large chunk of in like a week or two, a couple weeks, I think, by Marjane Satrapi. It is the story of her coming of age. It's kind of coming of age story by her, but it's also very much about her childhood in Iran, during the period where Iran goes from one of the most secularized Middle Eastern countries to one of the kind of most fundamentally religious Islam countries out there, and how that transition happened and how her family dealt with it, and eventually her leaving the country as a kid, and then there is a second part to Persepolis, which documents her life outside of Iran, I believe in France, and then returning to Iran as a young adult, and kind of revisiting all of the things from her childhood. This has been made into a really great animated movie, which I can definitely recommend. I'm not sure what streaming services it is available on, but if you're in the need of something to watch during this quarantine, this is definitely something worth watching. And I think she wrote the film possibly, and maybe even directed it as well. So yes, it's very much still her vision. I want to say she even maybe did some of the voices, the voice of herself, I think. So yeah, we'll be reading it, but again, kind of an Iranian French kind of comic. We will not be reading the whole thing, though. We'll just be reading chunks from that first part. Blankets by Craig Thompson. We're moving to the 2000s now. And this is a coming-of-age story about growing up as a kind of devout Christian. The author is writing about his relationship with his brother, his first romantic love, and the process of him kind of growing away from that Christian upbringing and from Christianity in general. Again, gets a lot of recommendations, and kind of hits it big even in the mainstream in ways that, Superman comics were not. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This may seem familiar if you have taken or are taking Ms. Sturgis Brown's Gender and Sexuality in Lit class. And this is Alison Bechdel's kind of autobiographical comic about her childhood and her young adulthood, and about her relationship with her father. Alison Bechdel is openly lesbian, and in a lot of ways the story is about her realizing after her dad's death that he had spent his entire life like cheating on his wife, her mother, with like young men, and that he was probably gay or bisexual, and this was something that he had hidden his entire life, and she did not find out until, he had died. And it's kind of about her coming to terms with finding that out at the same time that she's coming to terms with her own sexuality. And also, like, investigating her father's life and, like, what kind of person did this make him, and, like, how she had to reevaluate all of her memories of her childhood as a result of this. Really interesting, really, really good. Interestingly, several years ago, it was actually turned into a musical, which has gotten quite good reviews. Not the first thing I would have chosen to make a musical, but, like, I've heard it's really good. It actually, I think, was in Kansas City earlier this school year. I did not make it, unfortunately, but certainly, if you did, this is the story that was based on. And actually, I read a month or two ago that they're working on an actual movie version of it. I'm not sure whether it's a movie of the book or of the musical, and I only know about it because I heard that they had cast Jake Gyllenhaal to play her father. So I have brought this up and talking about Alison Bechdel. I do need to mention that what Alison Bechdel is probably most famous for, which is actually not this comic, but it is her a test that is named after her. You may have heard of the Bechdel test, which is basically a set of criteria that was come up with to kind of evaluate movies as en masse in Hollywood, to kind of look at how it's treating women. And the Bechdel test for a movie is, does it have at least 2 female characters? Some versions of this also require those female characters to have names. 2, do they talk to each other? 3, about something other than a man. And this seems kind of nonsensical. It's like, wouldn't most films pass that? Spoiler alert, most films do not. Most films do not have 2 women who talk to each other about something other than a man. Which, individually, like, often movies will have a reason for that, but collectively what it says is that there are not enough female characters being represented. Those female characters are often not getting to interact with other female characters. They're only interacting with men because there's, like, only one woman, the chick. And then if they are talking to each other, it's about a man. It's about the men in their lives. Which, I mean, I'm not a woman, but I would assume that women do talk about things other than men, and they do talk to each other. And so that seems like it's maybe not... If most movies are not meeting this test, it maybe seems like we're not representing women very well in Hollywood. So yes, the Bechdel test, really, really kind of interesting thing, and definitely when you think about, like, what the opposite of that would be, like, how many movies are there out there that have 2 men that talk to each other about something other than a woman? That describes, I won't say every movie, but probably like 98% of them. So the fact that that's so easy to pass and the Bechdel test is so hard to pass, it says something about Hollywood and the way it treats women. And that test comes out of a comic that Alison Bechdel writes as part of her long-running series, Dykes to Watch Out For. So, Funny Misshapen Body, a memoir by Jeffrey Brown. This is basically kind of a more recent memoir. He writes about his, childhood, younger life, the beginnings of his career as a comics writer, as well as his time at art school, his health struggles, substance abuse, etc. So as you can tell, a lot of these graphic memoirs are dealing with some kind of heavy material, and things that we maybe would not have associated with comics, 30 years ago, but creating these in comics allows us to engage with things in our memories and our past in ways that maybe it's harder to do with just text. So this is an interesting comic. My Friend Dahmer, again, recent, like within the past decade this time, is written by a high school classmate slash friend of Jeffrey Dahmer, who you may know as a kind of infamous serial killer. And this is a really interesting story and a portrait of Dahmer, because he was kind of he was part of their friend group, but also kind of not part of it. He was the friend that like no one liked and who they made fun of. And so it was this really interesting look at, it's kind of sympathetic because he is kind of this outcast, like misfit, reject, and they do treat him like really poorly. And I think the author spends some time trying to come to terms with, like, did we help make him what he was? Even as it's also kind of horrific because even at that point he's doing some pretty horrific stuff. And this kind of looks at, can you find the origins of his later serial killing behavior in his high school days and such? And definitely some really interesting stuff going on. So that brings us to the end of our autobiographical comics, and then we move into nonfiction comics. And again, there's a lot of different kinds of nonfiction comics out there. This is just kind of hopefully to give you an idea as far as what the breadth of those types of comics are. So there's a lot of different kinds, and here's what they can be. So one of the earlier ones is going to be, probably one of the earliest, is Ripley's Believe It or Not magazine, which was in comics form. Started in the 50s. And for those of you who are not familiar with Ripley's Believe It or Not, it was this kind of massive multimedia brand that, like, they've had TV shows and they had comics and they have museums and all kinds of stuff, all about, like, weird oddities and, like, unbelievable things. And so they did in fact have a nonfiction comic, as well as I think the more text-based books also often had kind of comics form. In 1957, and this is really interesting, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story was released. So this was a short comic on the principles of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance, and it told the story of the Montgomery bus boycott that Martin Luther King kind of like orchestrated. And it was distributed among civil rights groups, in schools, in churches, like all kinds of different places. And really actually played a significant role in helping disseminate this story, helping familiarize folks with ideas of nonviolent resistance, and it played a notable role in the civil rights movement. So in addition to all the kind of stuff we've talked about with comics as, kind of cultural artifacts, they can also have some level of, political power in the sense that anything else cultural can. So this did help make the civil rights movement as successful as it eventually was. Cartoon History of the Universe, which was, again, another very long-running comic, 1978 to 2002, is, as it sounds, a cartoon history of the universe by one guy. So he starts this project in 1978, and it continues until 2002. And then I think he does a continuation called History of the Modern World, which goes to 2008. So he spends a good, again, 30 years working on this particular project, and it's pretty impressive. Obviously, it's, not going to be as objective as your average history textbook. It's going to be a little more, entertaining and engaging and humorous, as you can tell from the cover. But it definitely is worth checking out, and you can learn a lot from it. I remember having this book when I was a kid. So, in addition to the things we might expect to see in comics, things like history, things like, weird shit, we also occasionally get comics kind of how-tos / nonfiction texts. So in this case, it's the Cartoon Guide to Statistics, taking like statistical math and making it interesting and engaging to readers. And this is actually one of the co-authors of this is the guy who did the Cartoon History of the Universe / World. Again, this is not the last time we will see kind of cartoons that or comics, kind of how-to books on like academic subjects and like stuff like math. In fact, our next slide is the Manga Guide to Calculus from 2009, which, again, just as the previous one, kind of attempted to convey statistical concepts through comics. This is trying to do the same thing with calculus through the form of manga. And there's actually a shocking number of like manga guides to blank, or like blank in manga, I think there's also a bunch of manga that take kind of weird, like, academic subjects and, like, kind of personify some of those concepts to make a manga. So you have things like that personify countries, that also teach some level of history. I mean, that, like, something like Hetalia, for those of you who are familiar with it, is maybe not... It's maybe not the most historically accurate representation, but you can still learn history from it. And definitely there's some that are more kind of explicitly educational than that. So a lot of interesting kind of educational and nonfiction manga that in some form or other. So true crime comics is also kind of a thing. The example I have here is The Beast of Chicago, The Murderous Career of H.H. Holmes, 2004, about a guy who, during the Chicago World's Fair, had a house built that he used as kind of a murder castle, kind of. It was a hotel, or it was a boarding house that he invited guests to, and they bait him, and then, he murdered them. I think it also served as one of the inspirations for American Horror Story Hotel, if you've seen that particular season of that show. This was, I think, one of the inspirations for that. It's part of this kind of ongoing true crime series by Rick Geary. In fact, he has a couple of ongoing true crime series. This one is part of his A Treasury of Victorian Murder, which is all about, like, 19th century murders. And then he also has A Treasure of 20th Century Murder. And a lot of really interesting stuff. So it might give you a few nightmares, but it's worth reading. It's well done. And kind of a local connection, Rick Geary is originally from Kansas City. So definitely a hometown author, sort of. So there's Logic Comics and Epic Search for Truth. So in addition to all these other topics for comics we've talked about, there are also philosophy comics. So this is a philosophy comic about philosophers, about mathematics, and in general, again, the sort of things you might not expect to find comics about. So AD, New Orleans After the Deluge, by Josh Neufeld. This was originally a webcomic, actually, and then it eventually gets, published in a more traditional print form. And it is actually following several real-life New Orleans residents, kind of before, during, and then after Hurricane Katrina. The author was actually a Red Cross volunteer who helped there, and I think that's how he met many of these people. And so, again, it kind of is very much about this kind of catastrophe, and what it's like during it, and what it's like after it, and what the effects of that are on these people's lives. So kind of as a sort of spin-off of the Martin Luther King comic that we saw earlier, the civil rights activist and Georgia Congressman John Lewis actually wrote a comic called March, which was inspired by that Martin Luther King comic, which is a comic about the civil rights movement. That's very much trying to kind of get at some of the same kind of vibes and such that Martin Luther King comic was able to back in, the 50s. For everything, I have not read this, but everything I've heard about it, it's fantastic. And it's gotten a ton of good reviews, and it's also kind of cool to have, a civil rights activist and sitting congressman writing a comic. So this is probably one of the most recent ones. Terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, or Princip, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. The assassin who ignited World War I. So this is in fact about Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which is the one that officially led to the outbreak of World War I. That said, he's not really the guy who started World War I, in the sense that if that hadn't happened, something else would, and what really caused World War I was all of these, web of alliances where, if you go to war with them, then you're going to go to war with us too, because we're their allies. But certainly, he was the kind of the match that lit the powder keg that was, Europe in 1914. And so definitely, this is kind of about his life, what happens to him, and of course about his infamous assassination. Again, it's kind of interesting, educational, historical work. Okay, we're going to end with These Memories Won't Last by Stuart Campbell. I believe this starts as a webcomic. And it's written by Stuart Campbell about his grandfather. And it specifically is kind of about his grandfather's, I believe, struggle with Alzheimer's. And it's kind of set up in such a way that reading it is meant to kind of mimic the experience of losing your memories. In that as you're reading it, certain things disappear or aren't there. And again, doing some really interesting things with the comics format, while also, having some really interesting things to say, content-wise as well. Dealing with Alzheimer's, that's some pretty heavy stuff, and from what I've heard, this actually does a really, really good job of doing that. So that is, I believe, the end of our day on graphic memoir and nonfiction comics. So definitely, if you have things you want to talk about, if there are things that this made you think about that you want to bring up, I will be putting a discussion topic on Blackboard for this. But even if you don't have anything to say about this, but you want to talk about the format of the class, or have questions about how things are going to go forward, definitely feel free to leave those in that discussion topic too, or you can email me. Also, if you have not filled out the tech survey, please do that. I'm going to be creating that GroupMe, but in order to do that, I have to have student phone numbers, and I won't have your phone number unless you fill out that survey and give me your phone number. So definitely let me know how this format seems to be working for you. We'll probably do the lecture days in this sort of general format where the PowerPoint and then, discussion board. I know discussion boards are probably not ideal for getting really good discussion, but I also want to make sure that things are not too onerous and heavy for you, and not too much of a time and effort commitment for you, because I know a lot of you are at home, you have your own lives, you may have family members who are ill, and so definitely, ideally, I want this to not be too demanding of you when you've got a lot of other stuff on your plate. So that's it for today, and I will be uploading this to YouTube, and that should be available also both embedded on a section on the side called online lectures, but it will also, or maybe I'll actually put in the PowerPoint section. I'll probably put in the PowerPoint section. But then I'll also have a link to it in the announcement. So if you don't want to log into Blackboard, go into your email, click on the link, and that'll take you to this video. And then, which I guess if you're watching it, you already know. So I guess I didn't need to say that. And then the discussion forums will be in like the little discussion sidebar on Blackboard. But again, probably won't have this up in time for today, but I'm going to try to, by next Monday at the latest, have a group me set up so that if you can't contribute to the Blackboard discussion board, you can at least, send to the group text and get some discussion going that way. So I hope you're all doing well, and here's to making the most of what we can with the second half of the semester. And again, I hope that if there are things I can do to make this semester easier for you, please let me know, because the goal is to get us all through this successfully, while still getting something out of it. So that'll be me signing off, and I will talk to you later.